Two and a Half Admins, episode 163. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Allan.
And here we are again. How Google Authenticator made one company's network breach much, much worse.
Short version, by dumping all of the secrets on your Google account, where it now becomes, instead of, two-factor authentication, half-a-factor authentication.
So Retool, which helps customers secure their software development platforms, made the criticism on Wednesday in a post disclosing that a compromise of its customer support system led to 27 of its customers, all in the cryptocurrency industry, being attacked. They say the attack started when a Retool employee clicked on a link in a text message purporting to come from a member of the company's IT team, because that's plain phishing, so I don't know how they're going to blame Google for that. But they say it warned that the employee would be unable to participate in the company's open enrollment for health coverage until an account issue was fixed. The text arrived while Retool was in the process of moving login platforms to Okta, which is a very large single sign-on platform. Most of the targeted employees took no action, but one logged in to the linked site and, based on the wording of the poorly written disclosure, presumably provided both a password and the temporary one-time password from their Google Authenticator.
Now, we do need to address a serious technical error in what you've said so far, Allan. It can't be phishing. It was a text message. That's smishing.
Sure.
But they claimed all sorts of stuff like deep faked voices on the phone and detailed knowledge of the floor plan of the office and stuff. I don't know how much of that we can believe, but I think the important thing is that there's no debating the fact that Google's Authenticator app does by default sync via the cloud.
Not just sync via the cloud, but in a way that if anybody compromises your Google account, they've compromised your Google Authenticator along with it, which is not a necessary component of syncing to the cloud for recovery and backup purposes. They very easily could have set that up to sync end-to-end encrypted, where, without the device or a password to unlock the whole thing, it's no good to anybody. So somebody compromises your Google account and they have a bunch of useless blobs. But that's not what they did.
It can be a bit of a catch-22 of how do you have two-factor authentication for recovering your two-factor authentication? It can be a real pain to switch phones and have to re-enroll in too many of these authenticators. But as with all security, it's always a trade-off between convenience and security. And Google has decided to move the slider way off to the convenience side without asking anybody or without giving you any options. So yes, your Google account owns everything. Don't let your Google account get compromised.
I want to move back again to something Joe said earlier about all the claims of deep fakes and AI voice mimicking and this and that and the other with the calls in to social engineer these folks. It reminds me of when I was attending Navy boot camp in Orlando, Florida. Anytime somebody got in a bar fight with kids fresh out of boot camp and didn't do too well, they always got jumped by 10 SEALs every time. It's never just, I picked on the wrong 18-year-old kid that just got out of boot camp. No, it's like a whole squad of SEALs. Some things never change. Moving back to the actual meat of the story, though, this is also kind of another example of a pattern that I try to make people aware of pretty frequently, which is you have to be careful to choose security solutions based on your own threat model and realize what the model of the provider that you're using is, because they won't always match up. One of the most famous examples of this was Wired reporter Matt Hannan, who owned the Twitter handle @MAT back when Twitter was, hot and people wanted to be there. 3-letter Twitter handles were just as hard to find as 3-letter domain names, and Hannan refused to sell his for, I think it was $10,000 to some rando who got hold of him saying he wanted @Matt. And the rando attacker then just went through a string of social engineering exercises that began with Apple iCloud. And, I was very irritated at the time because everybody's like, oh, poor Matt, he did nothing wrong. And Matt, if you're listening, buddy, I'm not trying to jump on you too hard, but I always thought it was a mistake to say you did nothing wrong, because what you did is you secured something that was worth an easy 5 figures using a service that's targeted at Joe and Jane six-packs sitting at home who absolutely expect to be able to call up to Apple and say, oh, I can't get into my account, and, with a little bit of sobbing, be allowed back in. which is exactly what happened. Now Google is doing the same thing. And Google's arguments are exactly the ones that I said that Apple would make about their security policies. Google is saying, well, look, we're trying to do the best thing for the most people. And that means, we have the automatic syncing because people have trouble managing it when they change devices with their TOTP. So this is the best answer for the most people. And that's why this makes sense. Now, that's not the worst argument that Google could make, honestly. Because yes, they do have literally millions of customers who aren't that sophisticated and do need that level of handholding, and this is a blessing for them. The real argument to be made here is much like the one I made about, Matt's screw up with his Twitter handle back in the day, which is, look, you should have realized the value of the thing that you're securing and realized I should not be securing this with a service that is targeted to Joe and Jane six-pack when I actually have, in this case, almost certainly millions of dollars worth of secrets to protect.
Yeah, and there's two other sides to this. One, I remember with Matt, because they compromised iCloud, they were able to remotely erase his iPhone and laptop because they used the lost my phone thing and basically remotely destroyed his computers in addition to taking over everything. But the interesting one here is the ultimate targets of this were a bunch of customers in the cryptocurrency industry, which I'm laughing at, but separately, they trusted this retool company to provide their software development platform, and they were outsourcing their authentication to Okta and so on. And at some point, if you're one of the cryptocurrency customers here, you don't even know what security provider your provider is getting provided from. And it gets so many steps away that how do you know what your threat vector is when your threat vector is, oh, this company that I hired another company which didn't secure its stuff well enough, and they got attacked.
In other words, you're once again advocating for SPOF, but this time it's security bill of materials.
Honestly, for that one, I think maybe you should consider an authenticator thing hosted by somebody you're paying directly to do a good job. That doesn't guarantee they will do a good job, but you'll have a bit more visibility and a bit more recourse when they don't than when it gets all these layers away from you. And, people should also maybe not use the same Google Authenticator that they do for their Facebook account for their work stuff. That's why you want authenticators tied to work stuff as, a separate app on your phone or a separate profile, so that if your Google account gets compromised, your personal Google account gets compromised, it shouldn't compromise your job's computer systems. And vice versa. If the computer systems at your job get compromised, they can't take over your whole life with your Gmail account.
There's also the approach of don't treat your first factor like an inconvenient throwaway to begin with, and it won't matter as much when you lose control of the second. In my case, I absolutely use two-factor for all kinds of things, whether I'm actively required to or not, because it's absolutely a best practice. But there aren't many cases in which I would be worried about that aspect of it, because my real security is the fact that I use unique passwords for everything. So in order for you to gain my password, you have to have already owned the thing the password goes to. If everybody did that, our entire species security profile would be immeasurably improved. It's probably worth mentioning also, not everybody out there is a retool that should be specifically paying some money for a, more secured product and yada, yada, yada. So what do you do if you're just some guy, gal, or non-binary other who is sitting around wondering, okay, well, I don't like what Google did with their authenticator and I don't like the way they're talking about it. I need something different. What do I do? And in that case, I would recommend Authy, which is not a Google product, will work everywhere that Google Authenticator works, will not sync your stuff off to Google, and even though it does have a cloud sync option, it is off by default, and if you use it, it's E2EE. So even if somebody manages to grab the binaries on the other side of that cloud sync without a password that you've used to secure them, it will do that attacker no good. And in that case, you would consider the 2FA. The first factor is the attacker has to own the cloud service that it's synced to begin with. That's your first factor. And your second factor is the password that you used for the end-to-end encryption.
Which was unique. You didn't use it for anything else, right?
Yes, for the love of God. If nothing else is unique in your passwords, please make the password that protects the rest of your secrets, whether it be a KeyPass vault or, Authy end-to-end encryption, whatever. That's got to be unique and difficult and strong. And I know all of our regular listeners are probably more than sick and tired of hearing me say this by now, but For anyone who hasn't heard me say it yet, remember, strong and cryptographically difficult does not have to mean 16 characters of line noise that you can't type, let alone remember. Use Diceware-style passphrases. Pick up the EFF word list, grab enough random words out of it for the level of entropy you want. I would typically recommend at least 5 words for your passphrase, and you will have just as much entropy as you do with an awful lot of line noise. One of our late night Linux families hosts, Amleth, I was talking with him about this stuff the other day, and he mentioned that he typically uses 7-word passphrases. And I want to say that you're looking at, I think it's 16 characters worth of line noise before you achieve the same entropy as his 7-word passphrases. And I promise you can absolutely both remember and type 7 relatively short dictionary words a whole lot better than 16 characters of line noise.
Let's do some feedback then. Chris writes, I was hoping to get a bit of a rundown on what Allan does with his TV boxes that he talks about from time to time. Can you watch all the streaming services without much fuss? Do you have some kind of kiosk mode that you use or something? What do you do to control it from the couch, and how well do they hold up? Do you have any struggles with that setup?
So it's pretty basic. It's just a normal computer running a regular operating system, mostly with Firefox as the browser. For YouTube, I have a browser extension that, when going to YouTube, lies about the user agent and pretends to be a Samsung Smart TV. So I get youtube.com/TV, which gives me an interface for YouTube that you can navigate like with just arrow keys or whatever. So to control it from the couch, I put a link to a $25 remote I bought off Amazon that has like arrow buttons, and you can control the mouse like with a Roku remote kind of thing, like a accelerometer based thing, so that you can easily point and click on stuff. And it gives you right click and left click. And on the back, there's a keyboard for typing in addresses and stuff. My biggest pet peeve with it is that it has Alt and Alt-Ger and all the other keys you might need, but no tab key, so you can't do Alt-Tab.
Surely you can remap that in Windows, because you kind of glossed over that part. A regular operating system, you say.
With what I'm doing, it doesn't have to be Windows. Mine happens to be because my wife has to use it too, and so on. And so it being Windows is just easier. So it's Firefox, and we have, Amazon Prime, Nebula, Curiosity Stream, and a bunch of other streaming services and so on that way. And then I also use the home theater version of Plex, which again provides an interface that works well with the remote, where it's just the arrow keys do almost everything. It's like arrow keys enter and escape control pretty much everything, and it controls the volume and stuff. And it works very nicely.
So it's just a regular installation of Windows in this case, but it could as well be Linux potentially, just on x86 hardware.
Yeah.
It's not going to be Linux on Allan's hardware.
No, well, it could be FreeBSD potentially, but then, he wouldn't have sound or something or network.
Yeah.
Sound and network would be fine on it, actually. The video might not play back as smoothly.
I was just about to say, how about the video for your television application, Allan?
It's Intel integrated graphics, so the driver's there.
Yeah, good luck getting QuickSync and stuff working.
Well, actually, the biggest problem, I think, would actually be possibly the DRM bits from the browser not wanting to work, because the binaries are only provided for Linux, Windows, and Mac.
And now that you've mentioned that, let's talk about an alternative approach, the way that I handle this stuff. I have also got a TV box, but I went a different direction, Allan. My TV box is Kolide, which that's an offshoot of the old Xbox Media Center, which I have loved dearly for 20 years now. Kolide is great if you have got a bunch of, let's just say, viewable Linux ISOs on a server somewhere in your house. You can point Kolide at it. You can point it there over Windows networking or NFS or SSHFS, which is actually what I use. And it all just works. There's nothing funky going on. Kolide doesn't need to transcode anything, unlike most solutions like Plex. Rather than having 1 or 2 preferred codecs, and if it encounters something else, it'll try to transcode on the fly. It just plays whatever it finds using the appropriate codec to play it, which I have found to greatly simplify a lot of things that otherwise were annoying me when I tried to use things like Plex. Now, that's just for my viewable Linux ISOs, of course. For streaming services, I actually don't try to do that on my own hardware at all. I just bought a Roku. It's like $70, does 4K, the most consumer-friendly possible interface, does every streaming service you can think of. And unlike a do-it-yourself box, when some jerko at one of these services decides, let me go ahead and turn on the device path verification for Widevine, and immediately wipes out your Linux boxes and even your Windows boxes and all kinds of things, it ain't touching that Roku because they know that there are millions of Joe and Jane 6-packs using those Rokus, and they do not want to interrupt those folks' service, so it just keeps right on working. Now, it also can tie into some of the open source stuff that Allan was talking about. Allan makes great use out of the Plex media server, and guess what? I access that from my Roku. There's a Plex app for it, and I just installed that, and Allan gave me access to his thing, and I can watch Allan's viewable FreeBSD ISOs.
Yeah, so I did a similar thing for my mother. I got her a new smart TV for the living room and she loved it. And it was one of the ones off Amazon that had a Roku built into it. It was just a Roku smart TV. But she has a second TV in her bedroom that was just slaved off her cable box. But suddenly she wanted all this stuff she was used to on Roku now on the TV in her bedroom. So I bought a Roku Express, which is basically like a HDMI dongle that just plugs in. It's $40 Canadian, which is probably only like $30 US. And it's basically a little dongle that goes into the TV and a remote. And it lets her use Plex, Amazon, YouTube, whatever, all the Roku apps you can think of. Turns any dumb TV into a smart TV for $30.
$40 Canadian is $30 US plus 2 bottles of maple syrup for anybody who's wondering.
But can a Roku box talk to a Samba share?
Absolutely not.
Right. So that's why you need that second box then.
That's why I've got the Kodi box. Whenever I want to watch my Linux ISOs, then I just change my TV input over to the Kodi box and do those things from there. It's the ideal tool for that, and the Roku is the ideal tool for the streaming stuff. So rather than try to force everything, down one single path, I just use what works best for the things that I want to do.
You're saying that you're Unix philosophying your TV watching.
That is exactly correct. I mean, what would you expect from a guy who has just coined both the terms viewable Linux ISO and viewable FreeBSD ISO in the space of 10 minutes?
Yeah, in the case of my mom, there is no Plex server at her house, just the one at my house. So it just means a service that used to just be part of my home lab is now a production service because the rest of my family depends on it now.
Janice and I talk about watching Canadian TV when we're thinking about watching something from your Plex server. I may have taken a couple of liberties when I described the setup to her. I actually told her it's Allan's FreeBSD laptop in his basement. It was just funnier that way.
It's close, other than the fact that it's a 40-core server.
It also gave you more credit than you deserve, so, I feel kind of good about that.
Works for me.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide, and Kolide has some big news. If you're an Okta user, they can get your entire fleet to 100% compliance. If a device isn't compliant, the user can't log into your cloud apps until they fix the problem. It's that simple. Kolide patches one of the major holes in zero trust architecture, device compliance. Without Kolide, IT struggles to solve basic problems like keeping everyone's OS and browser up to date. Unsecure devices might be logging into your company's apps because there's nothing to stop them. Kolide is a simple device trust solution that enforces compliance as part of authentication, and it's built to work seamlessly with Okta. The moment Kolide's agent detects a problem, it alerts the user and gives them instructions to fix it. If they don't fix the problem within a set time, they're blocked. Kolide's method means fewer support tickets, less frustration, and most importantly, 100% fleet compliance. So visit kolide.com/25A to learn more or book a demo. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Allan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Majid says, I have a question about external hard drives. I'm in the market for a new one, and I'm having trouble deciding between Seagate and Western Digital. I've had a bad experience with Seagate's 4TB Backup Plus, which failed on me after a short period of use. I know this is a portable drive and not a 3.5-inch desktop drive, but I'm worried that Seagate's quality might be subpar across their product line. I've heard Jim talk about the reliability issues with Western Digital drives in the past, but I'm not sure if they've improved since then. As someone who's been in the industry for a while, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the current state of external hard drives and which brand you would recommend.
I'd recommend not buying an external hard drive. Get an enclosure and put a real hard drive in it.
Yes, that is exactly correct. That is we probably should lead with that. That's the first thing. And The reason that we would recommend buying a caddy and buying a hard drive and putting the hard drive in the caddy yourself rather than simply buying it all done that way from the factory is because the hard drives that actually go in those things from the factory are generally enterprise hard drives that didn't meet the QA testing to go out as enterprise hard drives. So they wind up in these caddies where they face the most demanding possible environment that they weren't designed for to begin with. And like I said, frequently, they didn't pass QA. Now, the reason that I say that is because one of the most common complaints that you come up with from people who shuck drives is they talk about like really annoying whines coming from the drives when they shuck them and put them in their servers. Well, whines mean that those bearings are not in the best shape, which one would imagine is hopefully a QA problem because you do not normally expect brand new enterprise drives in a data center to have god-awful bearing whine. Now, they will be very loud, which again, even without the whine, is a common complaint about, factory-made portable hard drives, is they're quite loud. Well, it's because, again, data center drives, a little cheap shell, they're going to be noisy. However, if you just buy your own caddy and buy your own drive, you can get a good drive that was actually designed for NAS-type use, which is around the right profile that we're looking for here, has not failed any QA checks, and is not in any way a dodgy piece of gear. Now, you do still have the issue that when you're talking about a portable mechanical hard drive, these are rotating devices with relatively flimsy internals. They do not appreciate being banged around. They don't like rapid thermal expansion and contraction. So this is not going to be a good fit if you want like a thing that you're just constantly leaving in your backpack and, bringing in and out of the, the cold into the heat and the air conditioning and the blazing sun and all that. It's not going to live very long, even if you do your own thing with your own drive and caddy. If you need to subject it to a lot of mechanical and, thermal stress, I would strongly advise you to instead buy your own solid state drive and put it in a caddy. That way you avoid all the issues with mechanical stuff and, the vast majority of the thermals as well. Because you do buy your own caddy and your own separate drive, you also protect yourself from the case where you think you're going to be able to shuck a drive, but it turns out that the drive actually doesn't have a SATA port on it anywhere because the whole thing was ripped off and, a special interface to the caddy was actually soldered onto the drive's board. I've seen that many times. That won't happen if you buy your own drive. The last thing I'll say here is make it a 2.5-inch SATA drive, not an NVMe. I know NVMe is the sexy hotness that everybody's all looking for, but you're on the wrong end of the USB interface. You're not going to see all that speed anyway. And above and beyond that, the other thing that NVMe M2 drives are very famous for is overheating. And you're going to be putting this thing in a little chassis with no airflow, active or passive, and expecting it to work for a long period of time. Don't go NVMe.
No, what you want to do is just buy one of those SanDisk Extreme USB drives. I hear they're pretty cheap at the moment.
You'll note which of the three hosts made that recommendation. Respond accordingly.
No, don't really. They're the ones that die and not die, but just wipe your data randomly. And did we speculate that might be a heat issue? I don't think we did on air, but maybe off air. Either way, yeah, you want to avoid those.
But yeah, kind of to Jim's point especially, there's a big difference between an external hard drive and a portable hard drive, even though they're kind of interchangeable. If you want a 3.5-inch hard drive that's going to sit on your desk and plug in over USB and maybe be able to move to another computer, then yeah, an enclosure and a big Seagate NAS drive is a great way to go. If you want something you're going to carry around with your laptop in the bag or something, then you probably want something solid state that can handle getting bumped around. But like Jim said, NVMe has heat issues, and you're not going to get that performance because it's on the wrong end of USB anyway. Even if it's USB 3/C, etc., you're better off with a regular SATA-based SSD because it's going to not cook itself to the same degree.
The last thing we should probably address, although we're kind of doing things in the reverse order, should you be happier about Seagate or Western Digital right now? No, Western Digital is still very much in the toilet. They are still the subject of incoming class action lawsuits for various shady things they've done. Do not recommend in any way, shape, or form. If you want a Rust hard drive, I recommend Seagate Ironwolf. Seagate has said all the right things for the last few years about the various fiascos that have hit the storage industry, They have gotten tarred in a couple of them to a degree themselves, but they've just never gotten in as deep as the other options. So that is very much who I'd recommend. And on the solid state side, your cheapest good option is usually going to be like, a Samsung Evo or, maybe a Samsung Pro if you're concerned about, a lot of heavy write usage. Although if you're doing that, probably again, going the over USB route is not going to be your friend anyway. The other option that I'll mention there, because it's not that much more expensive, you can get a proper data center drive with like power loss protection and, hardware QoS and all that good stuff from Kingston. Their former line was the DC500. They had a DC500R and DC500M. That was sort of like the relationship between Samsung's Evos and Pros. The Rs were for, a mostly read workload, so they didn't have as much write endurance as the 600M. I'm sorry, the 500M. But those are, again, there's still tons of those drives out there. That's not the current line. The current line is the DC600M. For like a 2 terabyte drive, I looked it up recently, and the prices were only off by I think like $40. Between those and the cheap consumer drives like Samsung Evos, and in my opinion, that's a great $40 to spend.
You said Iron Wolf is a good way to go if you're going to go the spinning rust route. What about the Exos drives?
I don't recommend that consumers buy Exos drives because saying Exos drive doesn't mean anything. Exos is not a consumer brand. It does not actually associate anything that consumers think about in terms of differentiation. An Exos drive could be an archive drive. It could be a NAS drive. It could be a camera drive. It could be just about anything. Because if you're buying Exos, you have to read the whole freaking data sheet. And that's a bit much to expect consumers and frankly, even, most of our listeners to do. I don't want to read an entire data sheet every time I'm buying a drive, but you really do have to do that if you're going for enterprise stuff. The other issue is, even if you get the exact right Exos for what you want, like the closest thing to a proper NAS drive in the Exos line is going to be a data center drive. And one thing that data center drives absolutely do not care about is how much noise they make. But most people that are going to put a hard drive in their house, they definitely care about how noisy it is. So yeah, stay away from Exos, stay away from Western Digital's equivalent. What do they call theirs, Allan? Their enterprise line?
They stole the name from
Ultrastar.
Yeah, they stole the name from HGST.
Yeah, if you're a consumer, stay out of the Exos and Ultrastar stuff. I promise you, there's nothing good in there for you. It's going to cost you more money and it's not going to be designed for you. And like I said, you're going to have to really read the data sheet to figure out what you're going to get. Just buy the brand that actually targets what you're trying to do from a manufacturer that you can trust reasonably.
Yeah, I've been basically nothing but Seagate for 20 years, and I've been very happy.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Allan Jude.
We'll see you next week.